Hello, good morning. I'm Ellen Ross. Our session is has the mandate of looking at the institutionalization of women's history, especially in Britain, its political connections, its journals, its university connections, and maybe, I don't know what our speakers are going to say, but they're also allowed to talk about its general relation to the social history of the time in the 70s and the 80s and later. So I'm going to introduce each person very briefly. Their vitas are very long, list of publications are over the top, so I'm just going to mention a few things about them just to identify them. Okay, so I'm going to start with Penny Summerfield, who's Professor of Modern History at the University of Manchester and was before that at the University of Lancaster. And I'm sure you know about her work on women in the Second World War. And she also wanted you to know that she had been an administrator of women's studies programs a number of times. Okay, Penny.
Am I starting?
Yes,
oh,
you're starting.
Great. I thought I was last and there'd be nothing left to say. Thank you. Okay, now have I got this close enough? Is this okay? Good. Right. Okay. Well, now, after accepting the invitation to be on this panel, for which many, many thanks, I felt the need to know about more people's experience of women's history than just my own. So I decided to post a link to a short set of questions in the online Women's History Network newsletter in the UK. I received 28 replies from women with many different types of involvement in women's history. Some are well-established historians, others are recent adherents. Some are academics, others are school teachers, women in media, women in retirement. Some were involved in the 1970s, others have only just discovered women's history. Now, this is obviously a small-scale, non-quantifiable survey, but it does give a variety of perspectives. And I'll refer to some of the replies, as well as drawing really quite extensively on my own memories and impressions in what I'm going to say. And by the way, I did check out with the women who replied, who I name, that it was okay to name them, right? We've been asked to address the issue of institutionalization. And I wondered if the replies would complain that women's history has become too ivory tower. But these respondents from in and out of institutions of higher education describe a dialogic relationship between academic women's history and groups outside academia, such as the media, schools, community history groups, and publishers. The problem of institutionalization that comes through isn't of women's history's separation from the wider society. It's actually what Catherine Gliedel referred to earlier, the problem of creating structures over time within which women's history as an academic subject was and is secure and could and can develop. So that's my theme, really. I'll start with 1970s developments, and this is quite autobiographical. In the 70s, women's history, in my experience, grew up without academic institutional support in Britain, though it had lots of links with academia through the people involved. As a student of history in Brighton in 1971-2, I joined a women's history study group that was an offshoot of the women's liberation movement, and the members were students and ex-students and non-students, and we met in basements and kitchens, and we read up on and discussed women activists, Clara Zetkin, Alexandra Kollontai, Sylvia Pankhurst, Emma Goldman, and we were encouraged by Sheila Rowbottom's work, Women, Resistance and Revolution in 1972, Hidden from History in 1973. That group flourished for a year or two, then it was subsumed in other things to do with WLM, campaigns and consciousness-raising groups. I moved to academic posts in the north, to Durham and then to Lancaster, where in the mid to late 1970s and 80s, I was involved in various feminist reading groups and later a women's history reading group, where we discussed Ivy Pinchbeck and pulled her to bits, but admired her enormously too. Now, these, and actually, yeah, we read anything. I mean, we read The Tyranny of Structurelessness. We read Compulsory Heterosexuality. We read articles in Spare Rib about the suffragettes. We read New Left Review, the domestic labour debate. We read and adored new publications, new monographs, Barbara Taylor, Natalie Zeman Davis, Carolyn Bynum, that were coming out in the 80s. Now, the feminist reading group, the women's history reading group, were closely linked to academic institutions, and they were mainly composed of lecturers and students. And from these crucibles, developments went in two directions. One was creating space for women's history research and discussion within the learned societies, many of which were themselves products of a kind of new left history from below movement. And the other direction was establishing women's history research and teaching within academic institutions. So now I'll talk a bit about seeking accommodation within learned societies. Several of the respondents to my little survey write of being inspired but frustrated by labour history. Inspiration in the 1970s came from labour history's attention to radical activism and to attempts by subordinate groups to change things. But as one of the respondents, Jerry Holloway, succinctly puts it, labour history was and is male-dominated. And it was a struggle to get labour historians to accept women's history. Another respondent, who you all know, Angela John, was the only woman on the committee of Llafur, the Society for the Study of Welsh Labour History, which incidentally, she says, had 1,000 members in the 1970s. Angie writes of the problems of getting the society to agree to hold women's history events, and then of the gratifying success of day schools and conferences on women's history that were eventually held under labour history auspices. Other groups also gave contested space to women's history, including in the 1970s the Ruskin History Workshops and the Conference of Socialist Economists, which some of you might remember. Questions and paradigms were shaped by the Marxist left. Work was important, trade union membership, strikes, labour processes, women as a reserve army of labour, class. In the late 70s and early 80s, we vigorously debated whether it was social class or patriarchy that explained the pay gap, the skills gap, violence against women, the historic imposition on women of childcare responsibilities, and conceptualization of women as mothers, domestic work, the treatment of women's bodies. There was a huge amount of concern about the essential importance of domestic labor for capitalism, for survival, and its exploitative gendered organisation. And labour historians often didn't want to hear about these things. We also challenged other learned societies to make space for women's history. In my experience, these included the History of Education Society, the Oral History Society, and the Social History Society, which were founded in 1967, 1974, and 1976, respectively, so quite new and quite committed to a history from below kind of approach. Now, I have memories of conflictual situations, particularly in the early 1980s, when trying to ensure that the History of Education Society had conferences on women and education, and later feminism in education, that were actually woman-friendly. And also to get Social History Society behind the history of women, which I think happened only through the history of the family, which was sort of more acceptable than the history of women. And at the gatherings of these societies, there were challenges by male academics to the idea that what we were doing could be important, combined in HES and SHS with hostility to the methods some of us used, notably oral history, which could only ever produce anecdotal evidence, according to a leading male Tudor historian. Now, there were quite visceral objections, possibly simply to the presence of outspoken feminist women within some of these societies. That's changed, but lest we think it's gone away, listen to Katie Barclay, doing a PhD 2003 to 2007. When I was doing my PhD, she said, I met a Scottish history bigwig, and he told me that women's history was a waste of time and said some derogatory things about my supervisors. Fortunately, I have never been a shy and retiring type, so took this in my stride, but I felt that it highlighted the continuing prejudices against the field by more conservative historians. Okay, moving on, briskly. Seeking a place for women's history within universities. Several respondents write of a complete absence of women's history when they were at university in the 60s and 70s, and others of being discouraged from pursuing their interests in women's history through research. We shouldn't focus only on women. One women's history publication in our field meant the bone had been picked dry, but theses and books were produced, and with them came the determination also to teach women's history. In my experience, that struggle in the to get a place for women's history in the academic curriculum was part of the challenge to establish women's studies. It was caught up with women's studies. I taught my first women's history course at Lancaster in 1982, and its introduction was part of an effort to create a women's studies undergraduate minor. Other British universities, York, Kent, concentrated on graduate programs. At Lancaster, we had a go at undergraduates. There was institutional opposition to the apostrophe, and also about the alleged narrowness of focusing on women, and about the conditions on which we could teach women's studies. If we could get courses cross-listed, fine. If not, we had to do women's studies as an extra voluntary work on top of our normal loads. Obviously, that wasn't sustainable, and it led us to put pressure on the institution to agree to women's studies degree programs. You know what Susan Peterson said earlier, we work to change the academy, even though the academy works to change us. And with the establishment of women's studies degree programs, we put pressure on to hire faculty. There was a problem. Where did these colleagues fit in the institution? And what I want to say is they didn't fit in history departments. Why not history departments? History departments were particularly obdurate about maintaining their, oh boy, solidarity. They only slowly and reluctantly started to hire any women at all. They preferred women who did blokey subjects like international politics to the history of women. I should explain that. At Lancaster, the job to which I was appointed in 1978 as a social historian was in a department of educational research. And I'm not the only woman historian who found her way into a permanent university job outside history. The Lancaster History Department had only one woman until the late 1980s. The new recruit in 1990 wasn't appointed as a historian of women, though she embraced women's history vigorously once appointed. But when she moved on 5 years later, she wasn't replaced by a historian of women, or indeed by a woman. And her academic course contributions went with her. Now, the institution wasn't closed to the idea of women's history by the mid-90s, as my own career developments indicate. In 1994, I was appointed to a personal chair, a very British phenomenon, and the title given was Professor of Women's History. Hurrah! But the fragility of the institutional situation is underlined by the fact that when I moved jobs in 2000 from Lancaster to a chair of modern history at Manchester, which I was invited to apply for, no professor of women's history was appointed at Lancaster to take my place, and there isn't that one there now. Now, that's a personal story, but it's symptomatic of the fragile hold of women's history as a separate, defined subject within British institutions of higher ed. However, in spite of this fragility, women's history and gender history research continued to flourish through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. And I should say, with regard to gender history, my survey shows that a lot of women historians see gender history as a competitor, often more favoured in institutions than women's history, and a route to, quote one of them, to losing women from history again. Myself, I'm inclined to see gender history as women's history's healthy offspring and part of women's history's huge effect on social and cultural history. Nurtured by the dedicated publications and networks created in the late 80s and 90s, which I could name, but I'll whiz on quickly, women's history and gender history couldn't, by the 1990s, be ignored or resisted either by the learned history societies or by institutions of higher education. all the same, neither women's nor gender history have a permanent structural place in British higher ed, in the way that, say, political, economic, or social history do. The inclusion of women's and gender history courses, and even components of courses, is still dependent on the enthusiasm and determination of individual faculty members. Even market forces, student demand, isn't sufficient to ensure continuity. The popularity of women's and gender history courses doesn't stop institutions refusing to replace departing faculty in that field, and even closing such programs down, as the sad history of London Metropolitan University recently illustrates. Several of my respondents reflect on these contradictions, and this is where I am winding up. For example, Helen Gurdon, who's researched and taught women's history in adult education and universities since the 70s, wrote, "I think women's history has become more accepted within academic institutions. The difference between my own undergraduate experience in the 1960s and the situation today is immense. However, I'm also conscious of continuing entrenched patriarchal attitudes, and these quickly come to the fore in the current context of cuts in staff, courses, and departments. Everything that we've managed to change since the 1960s can quickly be swept away. The gains of institutionalization are offset by the ceding of control to the institution." Now, although that formulation is powerful in its anxiety and regret, I'm doubtful that women's history or any academic subject could resist ceding control. Institutionalization isn't possible without the institution having control. Angie John writes more positively, though also anxiously, and I quote, "There is a worrying tendency to see women's history as no longer needed. At the same time, integration, carefully controlled and monitored, can ultimately change more than autonomy." These two statements seem to me to set an agenda for discussion. Is women's gender history still important as a discrete subfield? If it is, what has to happen within the institution to make sure it keeps its place?
Mary Hartman is the next speaker. Mary Hartman's the next speaker. She is, as you probably know, the former dean of Douglas College at Rutgers University. And when she stopped being the dean, she remained a professor there, and she's now an emerita professor living in Arizona.
What a commute. What has to happen with institutionalization? I want to get back and around to that. That was wonderful, and I think we can debate all of this, but I think it does have to do with equality in leadership. Because all the things you were describing could be at least ameliorated if there were 50% women on every committee, every board, but neither here nor there. I will go on and talk to you. I think I'm supposed to talk about Rutgers in particular, which I'm happy to do. Judy's going, yes, so, okay. Thank you, but I couldn't help, you know, everyone can't quite help going into autobiography a bit, can they? It's fascinating. This is the relic panel. I hope you are all aware. And don't we relics look great? Not you. No, my dear.
Definitely not you.
Anyway, I started thinking about our salad days, so to speak, and what they meant. And of course, then I looked up the quotation from Shakespeare. All of you know, but I didn't. It's Antony and Cleopatra, of course, and Cleopatra is regretting her youthful dalliance with Julius Caesar and refers to my salad days when I was green in judgment, cold in blood. In the later 19th century, the phrase became popular to refer to a time of youthful inexperience and indiscretion, didn't it? But Cleopatra aside, as you may or may not know, I did not, another female ruler picked up this phrase and gladly owned it during our own salad days, those of you of a certain age, and some members of this panel. And that, of course, was Queen Elizabeth II, who, in fact, reminded her subjects on the occasion of her Silver Jubilee in 1977. A lot of us can remember where we were and what we were doing in 1977. Well, she picked up on that and referred to a vow that she had made much earlier in 1947 when she was the heiress presumptive to the throne. But her father was still alive. They were on a trip in South Africa. And she was invited to address the British subjects, and she did so. And she said, "Oh, Sally, I should have you read this sentence. It's just so much." Yes, read that right there, and then the second one will be there. But here is the young Elizabeth. She's 21.
This is 1947.
Yes.
You want me to do Elizabeth's accent?
Oh, no, do your own, but it's more authentic for this crowd. They're mostly Americans.
I've got the Queen's accent. Do it.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of the great imperial family to which we all belong. Although that vow of 1947 was made in my salad
stop
days.
There and I'll fill in at the end. Okay. But then I will turn to you. Okay, there. 5 years later, again in Africa, but this time she'd married, and Prince Philip was there, and she had 2 children by then, and all the rest. So the quote from her Silver Jubilee, 5 years later she became queen, okay. Now, her Silver Jubilee was February 6th, just a couple days ago, you know, plus 6 years, was reference to her salad days. And it runs like this. Second.
Although that vow of 1947 was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, she admitted the cold in blood part, I do not retract or regret one word of it.
There you have it. Well, I don't remember where I was during the Silver Jubilee. I don't know how many of you do. I won't ask for a show of hands. But I do remember that 1977 was, for many of us, a kind of jubilee of sorts. Women's history was well underway. My book, Victorian Murders, has just happened to be published in 1977. Things like that, personal milestones that you think about. But what I do remember very well, when I'm trying to track down how did I get interested in women's history before I knew I would be interested in women's history, well, what I remember is the Queen's coronation day in June of 1953. And I bet a number of you here remember that as well. In this country, it was a huge deal. And you may or may not know that. School children were let out of school. In England itself, there were about a third of the population only that had TV sets, but about nearly half of the population managed some way or another. They went to public theaters and lecture halls and so forth, and they showed the coronation. And it is cited as the date on which television became entertainment, the coronation of the Queen. I can't say that this moment was any kind of a great epiphany for me about my future in women's history, but it made a very, very deep impression. because such a fuss was being made about this woman. A woman was in charge of a country. You know, I was 11, so give me a break. Women in leadership institutions. You know, what did that mean? What could it mean? It just gave me a flicker of excitement to know about that. Okay, moving along. I'm supposed to talk about women's studies at Rutgers, and I'll do that. I'm also supposed to talk about the Berkshire Conference, because believe it or not, I was a co-founder of the Berkshire Conference. I love to say that, but when you're actually in the process of doing it, it seems like a joke, you know? I went to the Berkshire people, hi Dorothy. I was a junior professor. I was not only not tenured, I don't think at that point I was even, oh yes I was an assistant professor. I was for a long time an instructor getting my PhD, but I had pulled that off. We complained about the Berkshire Conference. Does everybody know what it was? It was a group of women started in the 1930s who were mainly outcasts from the American Historical Association and decided, well, we'll get together and do our own thing. And they did. And it kept going all those years, and every spring we retreat in the Berkshires someplace, usually at the Red Lion Inn. And everybody adored it, particularly the older revered women that we aspired to be, sort of. And one year we said, you know, this is ridiculous. They have one paper, we walked in the woods. How many minutes do I have?
You have 6 minutes.
6 minutes, I'll do it. And so I asked for a hearing with my colleague Lois Banner, my other co-conspirator in all this. Hi, Alice. And they gladly accept. We complained that they selected the people who were going to give the papers without having an open invitation. And so when you went, you never know who was going to give a paper. Oh, that was the way they operated. Well, we thought that was wrong, and we complained about this, and we wanted to know whether we could do this. And they knew just what to do with Lois and me. They said, next year, you two are going to be in charge of the program. And, you know, then we kind of started playing around with this new women's history thing, and we could do that. And how about a large conference that goes beyond the Berkshire Association? Well, a lot of the older women in the organization did not want that to happen, but they wanted to encourage the girls. And so they gave us $500, and they said, you can have a conference, but it won't be the Berkshire Conference. We'll still keep having the Berkshire Conference every year, and thank God they did. And we had the first conference on women's history at Douglas College, the Women's College of Rutgers. And I've seen various numbers, and I can't tell you but how many there were. But I will say 500 because Hickman Hall holds 500 people in its largest meeting room. And so I've seen everything from 300 to 900, so 500 it was, and it was, of course, tons more than we had ever expected to see. And it was all quite wonderful. Institutionalization was taken over by the Berkshires, and they did a splendid job, I think. I got to be president one year as a reward for starting the conference, and we made it up all the problems that occurred along the way, and that was fine. Institutionalization of women's studies and women's history, as Penny has pointed out, is a more complex thing. It's still going on, as she's pointed out. But I can tell you that the unique thing about Rutgers was that when I joined the college and the history department, we had 5 full colleges on a campus divided by a river and a town, okay? And each one had its own history department, its own English department, its own everything. There was the men's college founded in 1766, and the history department was almost totally male. There was the women's college founded in 1918. The history department was not totally male, but it certainly wasn't even half female. Then there was University College, where Judy was, which was for the adult students and the evening students. And then there was Livingston, our newest college in '62, whose motto was strength through diversity. It's now mainly the home of the football team at Rutgers, but it was a splendid idea at the time. And probably I've forgotten one of the colleges, but in any case, the point is you were always off balance as a young faculty member in this situation, because unlike, I don't know if you read a piece by Carolyn Bynum at Harvard in the Chronicle of Higher Education. She talked about those very years of the 70s and how, because of the war in Vietnam and all the rest, the young men had become separated from their mentors and were revolting. And the mentors gave them all kinds of grief, displaced in the exams they gave them. And everyone understood the rules, and the women were totally on the outside. This was not the case at Rutgers. We had our own little ivory towers in which we magnified one another on our importance, and then we discovered at the Women's College, if we went over to Rutgers, we didn't exist. So it was a way simultaneously in the same institution to see so vividly whether you exist or not. And to realize how much of it is show and rules and all the things that Penny was talking about. Okay, I've got, 2 more minutes. I just want to say a couple of things about hopefulness and institutions and all. Mentorship. I love the way this conference has been put together with mentorship and how important it is. When I look back on my life and what mattered for me at every stage, it was individuals and relationships. And I think that this is an ongoing and very hopeful sign for the future. What do I see about what needs to happen? Well, we should put the men into the gender part a bit more than we've done, and that's starting to happen. You watch the kind of play acting that's going on the presidential leadership front with masculinity, and they're starting to write books about it now, and I'm so excited that they're aware of this kind of self-conscious play of, saluting and all this goofiness that I don't remember seeing years ago. And we've got so much more work to do within gender history, women's history, men's history, but ultimately it has to go back to the academy because I'm working on an article now on Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote an article called Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And she's got a whole bunch of ideas there that all refer to the workplace, how we have to change the workplace because women have to leave earlier than men do. And men, of course, redefined masculinity to mean that you don't leave the office until 10:30 at night, I mean. And so this has skewed things in a whole variety of ways. But do I think there's work ahead? Do I think there's excitement ahead in what we can do? Absolutely. There's just wonderful stuff out there. Now, I didn't talk about scholarship, but I just want to sing a song about somebody wonderful. I'm not going to do a mentorship thing. But because I didn't really mentor her. She wrote to me about my book on the family, and my goodness, she had seen something I had never seen, which was, you gotta spend a lot of time on siblings. Okay, Lee, I know, okay. Here's the book. There's the woman. Her name is Amy Harris, and it's called Siblinghood and Social Relations in Georgian England. Rush out to your nearest borders. But
It's from Manchester.
yes, it's from Manchester, of course, of course. Well, lots more in this disorganized but fun presentation, for me anyway, to share with you. But thank you so much. I think that it is such a gift to us all, particularly those of us who remember so many meetings earlier and faces. It has just been a treat. So thanks to the organizers for this wonderful conference, and to all of you for being a great audience.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Anna Clark. I have to say with pride that I was on her PhD committee, and she's done very well. So Anna is a Samuel Russell Chair in the Humanities at the University of Minnesota, and before that was a chair in the University of Minnesota. In keeping with my procedure of not listing people's books, I will not list her many books. She's allowed to wave one around, though.
I'm going to be talking a little bit. I just want to publicize this book because not only I, but Ariane Chernock have an article in it, Making Women's Histories, just out from NYU Press. But one interesting thing, and just the anecdote about the Berkshire Conference underlines this, is that in feminist history, each generation feels that it's an insurgency. And then the next generation sees the previous generation as the establishment. Mm-hmm. So we're all both, except for the youngest among us, both insurgencies and establishment at the same time. And we don't always realize that we're the establishment. But what I'm going to talk about today is the relationship between our ideas and our concepts of history, and the relationship between our notions of power within history and our institutional places as they change or lack thereof, and also our personal interests and our personal lives, which I think are really what together shape what we write. So I'm trying not to do too much reminiscing, and Judy and I have agreed, well, maybe agreed to tell embarrassing stories about each other or not, about Rutgers in the 1980s, which was really a very fun time. But what I really want to focus on is the London Feminist History Group, which I, like Susan, I was in the 1980s in London. And at that time, we were really nurtured in the tradition of the history workshop movement, very much so. And like and Sally Alexander, the feminists, coming out of that. And at that time, I think we all, on all sides, had a very materialist concept of history. We viewed power as based on coercion, hegemony, and resistance. But it's very much about power and force and coercion. And it was very much outside the institutional context. Meetings of the history workshop were in pubs where your greatest credential was to have a coal miner as a grandfather. That's what gave you cred. And then the Feminist History Group, of course, as Susan was mentioning, was meeting in very, very grotty rooms over pubs. We would be wandering around trying to find a pub to go in afterwards in King's Cross, which was not very fancy then, and told there's no women allowed in these pubs. Mm-hmm. So it was very different. A lot of us were very young and extremely militant. But we also, in the younger women of us, were chafing against the kind of dominant socialist feminist paradigm, where the debates were, capitalism and patriarchy, a lot of debates about production and reproduction. And in these early days, there tended to be ultimately an effort to say, well, everything comes down to capitalism, even if you're making a feminist argument like housework benefits capitalism. This is very, very, very early. And the kind of young insurgents then of the London Feminist History Group, we were more tending towards radical feminism and seeing sex, and we didn't differentiate really sex, gender, and sexuality at that point. But we wanted to see male-dominant sex as key means to the oppression of women, not just capitalism. So we had, I remember there's some huge chart of exactly where you were on the socialist, feminist, radical thing. So we were hugely debating this, and we collectively edited a book entitled The Sexual Dynamics of History, Men's Power, Women's Resistance, and which was published by Pluto Press, not a university press. It's not even on my Vita because you weren't supposed to have your name on anything. It was a collective. But we had enormous debates within this collective because Sheila Jeffries, if you remember, revolutionary feminist, very political lesbian, anti-pornography, was on that. And so it was very difficult for those like myself, and it was torn between socialist feminism and radical feminism. And then we had a lot of big, big debates on this. And so it was this context that I wrote my first book, Women's Silence, Men's Violence, and Sexual Assault in Britain, which even though it came out in the same year I got my PhD, it was very controversial. It didn't really help me get a job because socialist men were offended I claimed that working class men could be rapists, and radical feminists were offended I paid too much attention to class. And it was seen as too polemical. And this was a time, of course, when historical writings on sexuality and sexual violence were extremely politicized. And sexuality, now we're moving into, I think, about 1984, 1985, was center stage in the dynamics of women's oppression. But then now we're moving on to the kind of split, the pornography, anti-pornography movement. And of course, there's the famous Barnard College debates of 1984. Judy Walkowicz played a central role in a lot of these debates because her work on prostitution and the social purity movement, she made parallels between the late 19th century social purity movements and the dangers of those. And in Britain, there were, just as violent debates. And I remember being at, I think it was the Marxist Summer University in London, where there was a big conference on these issues, and just very volatile, of women standing up, proclaiming, that they were being betrayed, women were being betrayed, and violence and rape, and bursting into tears, and other women standing up saying, there's nothing wrong with penetration, I like penetration. So it was very, very personal, all of these debates. But we continued with both these personal and political things, and we did become more settled. Women's history was becoming institutionalized. I was able to study with Leonore Davidoff, with Judy, even earlier with Molly Nolan at Harvard, although women's history was not institutionalized at Harvard at that time. It was a big battle. And I think as we became more institutionalized and we kind of gave up our notions that history would be a very populist idea, the popular idea, but the idea that you could write best-selling books on women's history. That only happened if you're writing about the Duchess of Devonshire, not coal miners or anything. But as we became more institutionalized, and what we did is write books, that we began to see power not as material power, as force and coercion and hegemony, but the movement towards language and discourse, the famous linguistic turn. Now, of course, there's a lot of really good intellectual reasons for that movement, and I was part of it. I'm not denigrating at all. But it's also because we were sitting in our studies writing, and therefore we think that discourses are a more important part, more powerful. It's also that this was moving into the Reagan and Bush years. Even under Clinton, social movements seemed to be weak in the face of the conservative or neoliberal onslaught. Mm-hmm. So what we wanted to understand is why social movements failed, why they weren't working, why these discourses had such a powerful hold on our brains. But it was also personal issues, too, and I began to move more into the history of sexuality than women's history. But to relate it back to the early years of feminist history going back to the late 19th century, Bonnie mentioned Lena Eckstein, who wrote a very wonderful book in 1888 or something, on women under monasticism, where she saw monasteries or nunneries as a place where single women could have a life. And I remember doing research for Judy in the men's and women's clubs on her, and she was involved in it, but she was in this kind of love triangle between Carl Pearson and Maria, what was her last name? Sharp. Because Lena was in love with Maria, but Maria married Carl Pearson. So the issues of sexuality were much more complex with that. And I was doing research on Ann Lister, who was, other people had discovered, had written, volumes and volumes of coded diaries about her sexual relationships with women. So this is trying to be a segue into history of sexuality and queer theory. And one interesting thing I find, though, is that queer theory is very, very powerful in English departments, although I think its moment might have passed in English departments, but huge impact on English departments and cultural studies, but not so much on women's history, somewhat on the history of sexuality. But in some ways it's because what queer theory does is problematize any notion of identity, any notion of sexual difference as rigid. It's about the constant undermining of sexual differences. And Laura Doan's new book, which is just about to appear, it's called Disturbing Practices, is really interesting interrogation of queer studies and history, because she points out that queer theorists are always, queer theory study people are always criticizing historians for being too empirical, but they don't actually read history. They think it's all like Ronke or something like that. It's a very old-fashioned notion of history that they're criticizing. And Laura Doan defends historians, and it's really wonderful to see that defense of historians, that we don't want to find unproblematic sexual identities in the past, and we are conscious of our methods. But queer studies can also be criticized because it is still focused on same-sex desire, even if it's problematizing any notions of identity. And I think it would be more productive to kind of move in the problematization of identities into history, but kind of give up the focus on same-sex identities, have a more integrated history of sexuality overall. But to get back to the institutionalization question in my last minute or two, I have found that my graduate students, and at Minnesota, I don't know elsewhere, graduate students are very reluctant to look at resistance and experience anymore. They want to look at the powerful discourses that shape things. There's kind of a misreading of Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? And I don't know if other people have had that, but I'm hoping that might change. Because in our new political situation with the economic crisis, with the Occupy movement, I'm hoping students will think more about social movements, more about materialist analyses of history. Also, as we become more institutionalized, we tend to get bogged down. Just 1 minute. Oh, I do have more time. Okay. Well, I'm just about done. We maybe can think about different ways of institutional power. For instance, in the earlier years of feminist history, we did the London Feminist History Group had a conference. I can't even remember the date, but maybe 85, something like that. And we had absolutely no institutional support whatsoever. I don't know where any of the funding came from. And in fact, a lot of the Xeroxing happened because one of the people on our collective, Jay, I can't remember her last name, worked for Mills and Boon, which is the equivalent of Harlequin romances. And she did all the Xeroxing for the conference after 5. She did lose her job because of that. Jay Dixon, right. And the conference was kind of both wonderful and a disaster. It was extremely politically correct. No papers were turned down, so they were all 5 minutes long. And there was no caffeinated coffee. Instead, there was just some kind of carob drink. Oh. And so everyone was really cranky. But it was, it was very, very creative, and there was a lot of energy going on, a lot of controversies. But now as we've gotten more institutionalized, for instance, at Minnesota, for a long time we had the Center for Advanced Feminist Studies, which published Signs for a while, and did great things, and it was closed down by the university in about 2003, not for any particular political reasons, but we weren't getting grants. And we were very upset about this, but then we realized now we don't have to write annual reports every year. Now we don't have to meet with the dean. Now we don't have to go to all these meetings. We can do whatever we want to do. And we've also had, for I think 30 years, a comparative women's history workshop, which is now comparative women, gender, and sexuality studies, some long word. And we've never had any funding except for maybe $50 to buy cookies, and when that runs out, we make our own cookies. And we keep on meeting, we do workshops, and it has sustained itself longer because we don't have funding. So we don't have to worry about all the kind of bureaucratic things. We just kind of do the things we want to do. Now, I don't want to be too idealistic and unrealistic, because it's great having money. That's what makes all this possible, this very generous funding to bring us all together. But maybe we can remember back these early years of feminist history and that kind of energy that we had. We can remember that and regain some of that kind of creativity.
Now I'll introduce Sally Alexander, who is Emeritus Professor of Modern History at Goldsmiths College, University of London, a history workshop journal founder, and the editor of a wonderful new book called History and Psyche, Reflections on History, Politics, and Culture. The flyer, I just got the flyer. The book is just out this second, so I haven't seen it, and she and Barbara Taylor edited this, and Sally's contribution is a study of Winnicott in a striking new way.
Okay, thank you. Is this in the right place? Yeah?
Make it closer.
Make it closer. It's ridiculous how nervous one feels even after all these years of doing this kind of stuff. Thank you very, very much for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's wonderful to be here. And I was asked by Susan to speak about the early moment of feminist history in Britain, and so I should have come first before any of you. So I'm sorry, a lot of what has been said, what I'm going to say has been said, and to talk about the History Workshop Journal, or the History Workshop movement in particular. And the first point I want to make is the key difference, thinking of what Catherine said about national identity. If you were British in the late 1960s, 70s, 7%, between 6 and 7% of the population went to university. 48% of the population in Britain today go on to some sort of university education. That will be, of course, cutting in the next 10 years. But that's the key fact to contextualize this wonderful account of the origins of feminist history in Britain, which was all extracurricular and movement-based, and about, which Susan so beautifully evoked for us, and several other people have spoken about, and I'm going to speak about it too, but 7% of the population went to university. Mm-hmm. So a tiny proportion of those very clever grammar school girls like Pat Thane, Carolyn Steedman, went to university, but most of us didn't. I did do some research for this paper. I went to the Raphael Samuel archive in the Bishopsgate Institute in London, in Liverpool Street, and I looked through the records of the founding of the History Workshop Journal. I looked at the many, many pieces of paper. I mean, Raphael never threw anything away. So it's an account of the origins of History Workshop Journal, which is driven by Raphael Samuel's ego and capacity to keep keep documents. Oh, God. I mean, he just kept all the papers. He kept everything. He never, ever threw a letter away or anything. And I have to say that I found that work very hard to do, and wondering who Sally was when she appeared in the archives, let alone Raphael or Anna or Gareth or Jane Kaplan or Jerry White or Stan Shipley or many, many others, was difficult. It was another person, another time, and I'm interested in what, as all the speakers have been, in what unconscious affinities there might be between then and now. And in a sense, what I've got to say is part of a reconstruction of an apprenticeship, a historian's apprenticeship. So the first point is that feminist history in Britain and the history of the history workshop movement, it is always told simultaneously. Every account of feminist history in Britain begins with the first National Women's Conference, which was held at Ruskin College, a trade union college in Oxford, in 1970, and it came out of a suggestion at the 1969 history workshop that the next meeting should be on women. And famously, when Sheila Rowbottom made that suggestion, the whole plenary session, the whole hall burst into laughter. We were astonished that it should be such a funny suggestion. And the historians of the history workshop movement always note the strength of feminist history in the workshops themselves, not from 1966 when they began, but from 1969 at least. And I was a student at Ruskin at the time, and I gave a paper at that history workshop, which were huge jamborees of historians and Ruskin students. And I gave a paper on showmen, traveling showmen, and Romanes in the Oxfordshire fairs in the 19th century. And I gave papers alongside of Edward Thompson and Christopher Hill and other eminent historians. Keith Thomas, whose work absolutely was one of the foundations of feminist history for myself and many others. His essays on women in the Civil War sects, and his stunning essay on the double standard across several generations. So Keith Thomas is still one of my heroes. He's just a wonderful historian. And he used to wander into workshops, and they were the trades unionists and one or two women like myself giving papers as well. The editorial at that first national conference, I should say, there were very few papers on women's history in 1970 in Oxford. There were about 500 people. The creche was run by men. There's so many stories I could tell you about that first national conference, but I won't. Except to say that among the papers, Joe O'Brien gave a history paper on a study of 19th century Nottingham lace makers. Sheila Rowbottom, of course, talked on women in the French Revolution, and it was the basis of her definitive book, Women, Resistance and Revolution, which I think is still one of my favorite books of Sheila's. Jan Williams gave a talk called Women's Work is Never Done, which was kind of a history of housework. And there was a paper from Teresa Moriarty on Anna Wheeler and one or two others, but very, very few history papers actually at that first conference, because we didn't know. We were not that young. I was 25 in 1968 when I went to Ruskin, not that young. But we didn't know how much work on women's history was being done everywhere. However, when the History Workshop Journal was formed in 1976, the editorial in issue 1 was on, one of the three editorials, was on feminist history, and I quote, "We know that feminist history," we wrote, "has to be argued for because of the invisibility of women's work and relationships under capitalism." You're quite right, it was all about capitalism. We spelt out the concepts: work, domestic and waged, reproduction of labour, and ourselves. The point, we went on, was not to add women into the historical narrative, but that by foregrounding women, we would transform the history of capitalism, the family, and the welfare state. And we talked about history as being a battle of ideas, and history as being far too important, being left to the historians. The problematic was coined from feminist practice, study groups, adult education classes, workshops, pamphlets and essays, but historical materialism, Marxism, the capitalist mode of production, was the theoretical frame within and through which relations between women and men were understood. There was always a tension from that very first issue of History Workshop between a popular history, a people's history, and an attempt to theorize. And if you look at the feminist editorial, that tension is written right into its sentences. It's right there. And of course, the unsettling concept of sexual difference is imminent, latent in that first editorial. I was an editor of the first issue with Raphael Samuel and Anna Davin. I have no recollection at all of writing the editorial, which we no doubt labored over. But I do vividly recall the editing process itself, the long planning meetings and telephone calls, the commissioning from Ruskin students, from playwrights, from historians of film and theatre, from community historians. And the structure and organization of the journal, of course, had been decided at meetings in the previous year. And the back end of the journal, which was reproduced entire documents, historians' notebooks, works in progress, and so on, was considered to be a service to would-be historians. We were trying to bring, our aims were democratic. We thought we were trying to bring, as it were, more historians into the public arena, create more historians, as well as awaken historical consciousness. It was the height of the Cold War, don't forget. The most influential historians in Britain, as I've already described, were the Communist Party historian. I've already implied was the Communist Party historians. The Annales School, of course, in France were as well, but this is British. And we felt, bless us, that past and present had lost its edge. Now, in the last, I don't know how many years at Lyndall Roper, and has been involved in both the History Workshop and Past and Present, and many wonderful feminist colleagues who are in this room on the editorial, it's quite different. We considered self-publishing, History Workshop Journal, and after much searching, we used Titus Wilson, whom Tim Mason had good relations with when editor on Past and Present. We were active editors. We drafted and redrafted, and we worked with passionate enthusiasm and critique. And much of this came from both a left tradition and a Communist Party tradition of social and political history, but it also came from practices within the women's movement. And we took great pride in two articles of enormous influence on feminist history from Geoffrey Weeks, Sins and Diseases, in the first issue, Geoffrey Weeks' Sins and Diseases, Notes on Homosexuality, and Tim Mason's Pathbreaking, published over 2 issues, Women in Nazi Germany, which set the research agenda for a generation or more, and a recent issue of History Workshop Journal, I partly edited, which came out in number 72, which came out in 2012. It's a reappraisal of Tim Mason's work and a rethinking of it, and I think Molly Nolan is here, who was part of that. In the first year's History Workshop Journal, among the feminist essays that the History Workshop Journal published, and I'm going to give a list because, lots of you have, and there's no shortcut. Pat Thane on women in the poor law, Patricia Knight on abortion in Victorian and Edwardian England, Britain, Angus McLaren, a Canadian historian, on women's work and contraception, Anna Davin's extraordinary Imperialism and Motherhood, which is still one of the most reprinted and reproduced articles we've ever produced, Barbara Kane on Beatrice Webb, Denise Riley, Free Mothers and Nurseries in the 1940s, Olivia Harris, the late anthropologist, on household and family in Bolivia, Judith Walkowitz on notes on prostitution, Tim Mason on the love letters between Rosa Luxemburg and Leo Jožić, I can't pronounce his name, Jožić, Anne Summers on nurses in the Crimean War. Anne Summers, when I went back to the records, read all these files, I think virtually ran the History Workshop Journal single-handed from her room in Oxford with 2 children running around her in the 1970s. Ellen Ross, Neighbourhood Sharing, and an essay by me called Women, Class and Sexual Difference, which was about social movements in the 19th century. These essays were, I like to think, definitive and show a kind of fruitful cross-fertilization of the journal with feminist history. At the same time, the feminist history itself, 7% of the population went to university, folks, remember that statistic, emerged in adult education classes in the WEA and extramural departments of universities in London, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, and throughout Lancashire and the Fenlands. The Fawcett Library had moved from its home in Pimlico near Buckingham Palace to the basement of Old Castle Street and the Guildhall under the auspices brought there primarily through the work of Rita Pankhurst, the chief librarian, who was the daughter-in-law of Sylvia Pankhurst. And Catherine Ireland was the librarian, and David Duggan, the assistant librarian. David Duggan was a walking, and still is, a walking bibliography, and no account of the growth and development of feminist history should be without him. Courteous and generous to scholars from the United States and Canada, from Australia and New Zealand, from big Europe, as Margaret Hunt defines the continent in her 18th century history, Southeast Asia, Japan, China, etc., Brazil, I mean, from all over the world. David was a fund of information and so on. I ran a feminist history class there from 1973, the same year that the first women's studies tutors in adult education was formed, 1973. And it was there that I read Amelia and fell in love with many of the women who've been older, previous generations of feminists and scholars. Amelia Dilk, Josephine Butler, whom I still think I understand as much as or as closely as Judy Walkowitz. I mean, I just fell in love with Judith Butler for all her problems. Anna Jameson, George Eliot, Alice Clark. Maxine Berg wrote a wonderful biography of Eileen Power. I don't remember whether Bonnie Smith mentioned that this morning. It's a marvelous, marvelous book. And she and there was some very, very good work done in the 90s on economic historians and reprinted in, I can't remember the references, but that kind of rediscovery of earlier generations of women or historians of women and the feminist historians, economic historians and social historians was a very important part, but it didn't hit the mainstream, but it needs doing again. That's now a long time ago. And we published out of that class, feminist history class, a pamphlet on essays on women in law, medicine, peace, the Women's Cooperative Guild, with an introduction on methodology in 1980. It was published by the Women's Liberation Workshop. The Women's Library, as the Fawcett Library became, is now moving to the London School of Economics, and I could say much more about that. The Women's Research and Resources Centre was also established in London in the early 1970s and was very strong, and that was a new archive run by a collective for the records of the women's liberation movement and for papers of women's. There was a feminist history seminar that Anna's spoken about, and some history conferences. And Virago Press, as people have already mentioned, were reprinting many of what have become classics of feminist social surveys and fiction and autobiography: Alice Clark, Ivy Pinchbeck, Maud Pember-Rees, Beatrice Webb's diaries, Marjorie Spring Rice, and many, many more. So the beginnings of women's history in Britain, it was in adult education, in the WEA, and extramural departments. It also had support from two other sources, which I should mention: the labour movement and communist universities, which Anna's referred to, and I think Penny did as well, so I won't say much more about that. Except I would like to mention Jim Firth, a historian of the Spanish Civil War, of the Popular Front, of the post-war Labour government, of the engineers, a historian of trade unions and labour movements, who was head of department of the extramural department in the University of London, and who taught shop stewards through the TUC. He died a couple of years ago. And he really was responsible for bringing in people like Sheila Rowbottom, myself, Barbara Taylor, to teach in adult education in London. And without him, you know, who was it who said, one of the earlier speakers said it's all about, you know, individuals and personal relationships. Without that kind of initiative, Jim also, for example, at one of the one of the communist universities in London, thought of the idea that he should run an entire day on the history of emotions in politics. I nearly had a heart attack to think that anyone should be so bold in the mid-70s, but he did. He got all these trade unionists and labour historians to speak alongside of people like Sheila Rowbottom on emotions in politics. And the second source that I should mention were, of course, women who were scholars inside the academic institutions. There weren't very many of them. Pat Thane, Jane Lewis, Patricia Hollis, among others, Dorothy Thompson, who was always very critical, but nevertheless. And most of them were outside of history departments. I think that's a whole paper could be given on what Penny Summerfield has called the obduracy of the historical profession in Britain, and which some of us have mulled over, you know, even in the few hours that we've been here. Why was there this resistance to feminist history and to women's history? I think I have to stop, but I wanted to say that if there were also some very important men: Brian Harrison on the history of feminism, John Gillis on youth servants and marriage, the Cambridge Population Studies Group, who actually worked on the family and demography. And we felt, you know, women were buried in there somewhere, but nevertheless that work was path-breaking and very important. But by the 1980s, this early moment was over. If Sheila Rowbottom's Women, Resistance and Revolution, published in 1972, had inspired the early phase, then by the mid-80s, Barbara Taylor's Eve in the New Jerusalem, Denise Riley's War in the Nursery, but perhaps were among the books, but perhaps most of all, Family Fortunes, written by Catherine Hall and Leonora Davidoff, was definitive. Sadly, I might have to stop there, but I just want to say, to remind you of why. It was a study of sexual divisions and gender in property and inheritance law. The topography traced the changing topography of homes and workplace, family size, and belief. It was a study of Christianity, unavoidable in the history of British feminism. Jean L'Esperance in 1970 was one of her work on women's mission to mission, which was the work on Anna Jameson, and on philanthropy and its drives, really, was a pioneer in this respect. Lee, a sociologist at Essex, had already written on sexuality and domestic service, on the articulation of racial and sexual imagery in the private acts of love of Arthur Mumby and Hannah Cullick, anticipating philosopher Judith Butler's focus on the performative in sexual identification by several years. Catherine Hall had been a medievalist by training and was working briefly with Rodney Hilton on medieval history. She was a young mother living in Birmingham, caught up in the women's liberation movement, and part of the political economy of women's group, which produced some work on women in the First World War. It included Maxine Berg, Barbara Taylor, myself, Veronica Beachy. And she moved to writing a very influential pamphlet called The History of the Housewife. Before she began work on family fortunes and turning herself into a 19th historian. And that family fortunes redefined the field, the entire field of social history in the mid-1980s. Later, Catherine, with Civilizing Subjects, of course, redefined the field of modern British history again, with her emphasis on, the mid-19th century and the relationship between Britain and Jamaica through British missionaries and the government and plantocracy. The preface to Civilizing Subjects is one of the most succinct and clear kind of accounts of a historian's apprenticeship through Communist Party history, through the feminist imperatives, including the arguments over race in the women's liberation movement in Britain from the late 1970s onwards, her reading of post-colonial theory and her use in particular of Said and Fanon. I recommend that preface as essential reading for everyone interested. The 1980s also marked the end of social history's heroic phase, the mid-1980s, and the move towards the crisis in the historical profession itself that post-structuralism introduced, as it were. What came out of it were forms of cultural history. And if I'd had a couple more minutes, I would say that I think that feminist historians were in the vanguard of those intellectual changes within the historical thinking as a whole, with our emphases on representation, on sexual difference, on sexuality, on language, the work on memory, the uses of oral history. But I haven't got time to say that, so I won't make that claim.
Thank you, everyone. Due to my cruelty, we have 15 minutes for discussion. Tom. You have to do the mic. And don't mumble into it, please.
I won't. I have two questions. One comes out of the end of Sally's wonderful account, and I'm interested to know the status of psychoanalysis in these early years of the workshop movement. I mean, I think the first thing I read of you was in '83, the piece on Lacan. Is that correct?
Yes,
that was
probably. Yes.
I think that's the first thing on psychoanalysis in History Workshop, and that gets you away from the social history and from the women, and puts you in this other track. So I wonder if you could comment on the status of psychoanalysis, because it's also the status of psychoanalysis in the left in general is problematic, certainly the communist left. So that's the one question. Another question I want to ask everyone, the first three speakers just spoke about institutionalization, and it really comes out of the end of Anna's paper where she's speaking about the sort of energy of a group of people at a political moment to produce these groups, workshops that produce wonderful things. On the other hand, institutionalization in the academy is precisely not based on this. It's based on FTEs, which last for 30 years, independently of what's happening in the ferment. And I wonder if you could comment on this tension. The Berkeley example, which I have something to do with a group of Mike Rogan and Catherine Gallagher and Francis Ferguson setting up the Women's Studies program. And it was very important, the way we talked with Deborah this morning, in bringing people into the university. So we hired Mary Ryan, which we couldn't get into history, and we hired Judith Butler, and we hired Krista Luker, and we hired Evelyn Flux Keller. Now, all of these people, as soon as possible, left women's studies for the disciplinary departments, as did Wendy Brown, as did Katja Silverman. In other words, there's a sense in which the women's studies as an institutional development was very important in bringing people into the academy who might not have fit. But as soon as a fit in the academy develops, it sort of splinters. And so I just wonder what you think of this whole, of whether it should be institutionalized. I mean, obviously it should be institutionalized if it breaks down barriers. But more generally, it seems to me it's a real tension between the ferment that grows out of politics and its institutional structure, which grows out of the deep disciplinary foundations, which change in 15, 20, 30, 40-year periods and not in months, years.
Mm-hmm. You want to talk about psychoanalysis?
Well, maybe you should answer that one first.
Well, I want to get the answer to psychoanalysis.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, with women's studies, I have to say, women's studies departments tend to be small, and I think small departments tend to have a lot of conflict because any crazy personal dynamics get magnified when you have a small number of people versus 50 people. So that might be one of it. And I think also that, I mean, people change, and I've moved from women's history to the history of sexuality, and now I'm doing individuality. So you don't always want to stay in one particular interest, but it's kind of like capitalism can always take on insurgencies and make a profit from it. The academy does the same thing, but you always need the insurgencies from the outside to revitalize it, and the structures might change, but as long as you have that openness for it.
Yeah, that's a great question, or set of questions, and it gives me an opportunity to say what I should have said about Rutgers building women's studies over the years. It was those funny colleges that I talked about that played with our minds about what was reality, that also, during those years of the late 60s and early 70s, provided an opportunity for each college to pull in people who were interested in women's things and to put together their own women's studies program, as well as to bring into the disciplines lots of people who were interested in this area. So when they then amalgamated the faculties, we were huge in women's studies compared to a lot of other places. And in the 70s, Rutgers was growing when a lot of other places weren't growing, and that made a huge difference in our ability to keep hiring. Now, about the women's studies thing and the back and forth, Alice Kessler-Harris sitting back there can answer this question better than I, but I think, my thought would be, it still is a tug for people. I mean, I had a dear colleague in the history department at Rutgers who wouldn't dream of being in the women's studies program. A number of us, I mean, I was in the history program for years, but then I became a dean. And then when we had a structure for the women's studies program, which we were able to house in that facility we built, I joined the women's studies program and learned a lot about some of those tensions that you're describing from my colleagues. But at that time, I was so old, I was just kind of blinking at what was happening. But that it's the imperfect institutionalization that I think makes many people feel, well, first of all, they have their home discipline, and they always have that linkage with a wider group of people. So that also was and is a tug. But I think primarily it's incomplete institutionalization, and as soon as you get into the place and you discover your resources are more limited and all the rest. And I saw it writ large with the Women's College, which is why I ended up supporting the reorganized structure in the first instance with the faculty, because essentially we didn't get the summer release time, we didn't get this, it's now writ large in women's studies. That's what happens.
Right. I would say that women's studies in Britain's been particularly fragile. I think my colleagues would probably agree with me. It took off in the late 1980s, and this relates to what Sally was saying about the participation rate in British higher education, when there was a push suddenly to increase the participation rate to 30%. And suddenly universities were looking for new programs to attract more students who hadn't traditionally come into higher education. And that was a great opportunity. But by the late 90s, the 2000s, the trend was in the opposite direction again. And now these women's studies programs were vulnerable to being cut if they couldn't reach what were really unrealistic targets in terms of student numbers, targets which weren't always applied to other disciplines at that time. Now, my sort of memory, and what comes through my little survey really, is this kind of worry about, do we want to be separate? Do we want to be women's studies, or do we want to be integrated? And you know, many women's studies, really sort of the ideal is that every history program has women's history and gender history and the history of sexuality and gay, lesbian and bisexual history in it. And that, you know, that, and the frustration, as I said, I suppose, is that just doesn't always happen. And I suppose we have to understand it in terms of the history of history departments and the history of the history profession, which has been so resistant to change, basically.
So you were asked about your Lacanian interest in the 80s.
It was Freud, Tom. Well, anyway.
I looked it up, I wikid you.
All right. In 1970, after the First National Women's Conference, in London, we formed a group called the History Study Group, in which we read everything. But at a certain, and we also talked a lot about feminist practices like consciousness raising. And I remember distinctly, my memory is not playing me false, Juliet Mitchell standing up and saying, or sitting up rather, and saying, you know, there's somebody who wrote a lot about the things that we're trying to understand, the relationships between women and men and how deeply they go, you know, into our lives and into ourselves. And that's Freud, and we should read Freud. So Juliet Mitchell, being Juliet, read the entire works of Freud from front to back and wrote Psychoanalysis and Feminism and went off to train to become a psychoanalyst. And she'd also been working for, she'd been active in radical sort of psychological movements in the 1960s. But some of us just started reading Freud. And I do remember, Tom, I can't believe I haven't told you this story before. The first time I read his essay, Freud's essay on femininity, the 1933 one, the one that every feminist, is appalled by. And I nearly drowned. I thought he was speaking to me, about my femininity. So it was reading Sigmund Freud, first of all, and in a group, and reading it collectively, and using, I suppose, finding the idea of the unconscious and fantasy very helpful for thinking about, eventually, questions of subjectivity, of course, but also social movements and how they, get a grip on you. Why, which was such a question of so much social history. What's the appeal of a political movement? What are the conditions of existence, of the emergence of a political movement like Chartism or utopian socialism or the New Labour Party, etc. And we were very interested in what were the conditions of existence and the thrall of fantasy, the dreams, as in Sheila Rowbottom's language, that a political movement might imagine or conceive of would be one of the whole. So we read Freud for that reason, and yes, then I did read Écrit by Lacan, and I think I read him, the way, looking back, I mean, this is a thought that just came into my head this second. I think I read him the way some people read James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. I mean, or Shakespeare. I just loved it in translation. I didn't read it in French. I loved it. Now, most people found Jacques Lacan very obscure, but it spoke to me. And many of us, not just me. And it was a kind of poetry. I know people say it's very pretentious. So, but the point to make, won't go on, but the point, so that's where the interest in psychoanalysis came out of the movement, and the insights were very difficult to put into historical writing, and I still find it very, very hard to use anything other than the most kind of general use of fantasy or unconscious feeling. There's a wonderful book which does do it in 20th century British history, which has just come out by Bill Schwartz, called White Man's Burden, which really is arguing that empire is the unconscious of British culture in the 20th century. And he really uses memory psychoanalytically to understand how that works. But I feel I'm still a novice.
You want to say something quick, Mary?
To the previous set of questions, is
all right.
It still okay? I should also have pointed out something about what happened to women's history, and it's relevant to your point, Tom, about, how systematically and regularly the Rutgers History Department has been named the premier women's history program in the country. I think it's, it trades back and forth with others, but it's happened many times there. And within our own university, we have not been able to get the presidents and the spokespersons for the university to say, we have the top women's history program, that it's in a history department. So this gives you some sense of what we're up against in all of this. Another thing that I didn't talk about, but that we did, I spent the last 10 years or so of my life at Rutgers doing this thing, putting together a consortium about all of the programs that we have on women. The Women's and Gender Studies program, the Center for American Women in Politics, which has been hanging around since 1971, and a number of other programs. There are now 9, and one of our wonderful funders, Allison Bernstein, from the Ford Foundation, took over from me in 2010. She's adding 3 more centers of women in health and women in the media and so forth. So there is a whole lot of activity, but if you're a large institution, you still tend to tiptoe around saying, isn't this great, And it feeds down. As you know, you've talked about that part too. That's what has to change.
I want to stick a brief comment in. I think women's studies was so successful in the 70s because of enrollments. They were really, really popular courses, and they're still quite popular courses. A lot of women's studies programs have gotten their courses inserted into distribution requirements and core requirements and so on, so they're still prospering. And I think that it's great that those programs have existed, even though I know their prestige is less, and people do try to get out of them as soon as they can, but they are a much more flexible way in which women faculty can be hired. And I know at UNC in North Carolina, where I was last year, the Women's Studies program was sort of used as a sort of stable or back door for the history department, and other departments as well, and that was a good thing, not a bad thing. So I don't think we certainly oughtn't to denigrate them despite their lesser academic status. But that's all I'm going to say. Anybody else? Is maybe time for 1 or 2 more people. Yes, identify yourself.
Over here.
Okay. I have 3 things to say. I hope I'll try to keep them short.
The first is to pay tribute to the British women's historians in the following way. So in the early part of the 1970s, when US, and I'm speaking now as a historian of the United States, when our field was just beginning to develop, we actually turned to places like the History Workshop Journal, not so much to past and present, but to the New Left Review, because what they did was to both introduce us to and to legitimize the use of Marxist or socialist vocabulary and terms in American history. And what that enabled those of us who were then sort of beginning our push into US history to do was to alter the sense of what history was for women, that it could have a theoretical basis, which of course American historians had long dismissed, and that that theoretical basis could legitimately lie in the arena of socialist thought or Marxist thought broadly defined. And I'll give you one quite specific example of this, which some people in the room with gray hair might remember, but in the early part of the 1970s, Rutgers housed a labor history conference to which Edward Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and so on came. And on the panel, there was one panel on women. Lee Davidoff was on that panel. I was on that panel, and there were a couple of other Americanists on that panel. And in a moment I will never forget, Lee gave her Masters and Servants work she was working on, and Hobsbawm stood up from the audience and lambasted her in a way that was so angry and so destructive. It, first of all, caught all of us by surprise, but immediately created of the women on the panel, some of the men in the audience too, a kind of unity to try to understand what this was all about that stretched across the Atlantic and continued, and particularly continued into a late 1970s conference at the University of Maryland, which was a British-American labor history conference. So I guess I want to pay tribute, because as hard as it was for British historians, as Sally and Penny have described, to actually become part of the institutions in Britain, the kind of work that you were doing spread into the United States and influenced and inspired so many of us that names like Anna Davin, Barbara Taylor, Sheila Rowbotham became just part of our women's history. So I thought that should be said. The second point I want to make is on the question of institutionalization. I don't want to let the moment pass without noting that Gerda Lerner, whose name some of you may know and who died about a month ago at the age of 92, was perhaps single-handedly, if we were going to say that anybody was responsible for institutionally changing American women's history, for integrating it into the profession, she might at least have a lot of that credit on her shoulders. That in late 1969, early 1970s, she recognized, she was certainly not alone in doing this, but she recognized the importance of having the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, and so on, make room for papers in women's history, for women on the committees that the organization ran, for articles in the journals that those organizations ran. And by force of personality, you know, a lot of historians then and later denigrated her capacities as a historian. You know, we didn't like the history she did. But if anybody could have changed a field, made it acceptable, she certainly did that. And that should be, I think, noted in the institutional phase, that one needs that kind of leadership or force or power, and she did it at the cost of her own popularity, and that's a subject for another question. And finally, the third thing I want to say about women's studies, which I've been engaged in and for many years at Rutgers and now at Columbia, and history. So I've had joint appointments now for many years in these two fields. And the one thing I'll have to say about why women's studies remains perhaps weaker than it might be is because the power and the glory is all departmental. And the money is departmental. You know, tenure in most institutions, sabbaticals in most institutions, recognition in most institutions comes out of the department and the discipline that one is in, and generally not out of women's studies, even in those few places in which it is a department and therefore is recognized as such. It is still not fully integrated into the institution. Columbia, for example, which has a very strong and very good women's studies program, the chair of that program, the director of that program, does not sit in at the dean's chair's meetings. Well, you know, no voice, no knowledge, no passage of information, and so on. So that's my 2 cents worth of why women's studies will always remain weak until we can, you know, recognize that women's studies is its own discipline in a way. There'll never be an alternative. So, thanks.
Somebody else was going to speak. Go ahead now.
Hi, I'm Deborah Cohen, Northwestern. I have a question that I think there isn't time to actually fully answer, but I hope can be put on the agenda, which is where that support from unexpected quarters actually came from in the institutionalization phase.
Deborah, could I just ask you to speak a little more
Sure.
loudly?
Yeah, of course. It's hard to tell actually when you're speaking into the mic if you're shouting or if you're... Yeah. I'm curious about where the support on both sides of the Atlantic came from in the institutionalization phase that those participants at the time wouldn't have expected. In other words, what were the unexpected quarters where institutional support or support within this process of institutionalization came from? And I'm really curious actually about the comparison between the United States and Britain in this regard.
Do you want to say something about that, Judy?
I think when I think about Penny's discussion of the status of women's history in history departments.
Judy is not good.
Okay. How about here? Penny, how about here? Okay. Penny mentioned, this is just a very small piece of the puzzle. Penny mentioned how very much outside of history departments feminist history was in Britain. At a place like Rutgers in the 1970s, not only were there diversified departments, but social history was quite alive and well within the history department. And I'm not saying they're always your friend, but since already the dignity of history had been undermined by social history, there was room for women's history to make some claims. If you didn't have social history already somewhat valorized in a history department, it was hard to move forward. And my recollection is that Lee Davidoff was in a sociology department. Catherine Hall was in a sociology department. So just that little institutional difference of what counted as a valued practice in history that was not women's history opened up. And I know that Rutgers was one of those places. And so that's one of the reasons it opened up at Rutgers. They didn't do it on purpose, but it was it was a more porous, it was a more eclectic, it was more heterogeneous, and it allowed for that. So that's not the full answer, but those little institutional differences made it possible. And of course, you got the you were able to get cooperation from your colleagues. You had to get cooperation from your colleagues, and that's part of the story.
I'm afraid that we have to disband for lunch, according to the schedule. I don't know if anybody in authority is here. Well, I'll take the authority. I'll take the authority to put us into lunch. Okay.